we're not, I don't know what to do. Just find that volume button. I think that's fine, yeah. Voice a bit low today, unfortunately. Again, one of those days.
I like politics and learning how the world works.
Do begin.
Content over everything!
Go on. Will the what?
In France, they're rioting in France. What's the reasons for the riots in France?
Now, as I understand it, the protests in France at the moment are organised by a diffuse group on the internet which has protested about food price increases. And it seems to me that the reason it's taken on the character it has is because Emmanuel Macron wanted to make out he had some widespread appeal that crossed over the parties. That was the nature of his new movement. That he was not on the left and not on the right. He was a sort of a pan-Europeanist protecting general human rights and general values. Some sort of lost world of common sense. And for a little while that had a little bit of impact upon the people of France, and it enabled him to present himself when attacking, for example, the trade union movement, which has always been the stickling point for French governments, particularly French presidents, is that they've never really been able to crush the power of organised labour combined with the spontaneity that is the character of the French people and of the French masses when in revolt. And he managed to defeat the railway workers' union, so it looked pretty bad for a while. But then out of the circumstances which exist because he failed to raise living standards, improve conditions, resolve the problems in Europe, out of these circumstances a new movement developed that's supposedly non-political, that spans all the people of France, that the left-wing parties and the right-wing parties and most of the population support. And so this movement filled the gap temporarily, which the trade unions were not able to do. And there's nothing unusual about that. Generally in the past, in France, when society is in a crisis, it's often been the students who begin to move because they represent, again, this amorphous intermediate group between the wealthy classes and the working classes, who indicate, like the tops of the trees in the wind, where the wind is blowing. They indicate first when things are happening. And so in this particular case, a similar social strata or generic appeal has been launched by this movement in France, which, I mean, it may not have that much power behind it, I don't know. But it indicates that the time for Macron is pretty much over. And he's only been in power a couple of years. And already he's in a deep crisis, which reflects the generic crisis not only in France, but in the whole of Europe, which of course is the subject matter of the last couple of weeks, the crisis over Brexit. Now, I haven't studied the 583 page or whatever amount of pages document that they published so far that's supposed to be the legal basis for Theresa May's agreement, nor have I actually studied, unfortunately I've been very busy, the political declaration. But my essential position is I support the removal of the Conservative government. And I support that because I want to see a change in British society that improves the lives of the mass of the people of Britain. Simultaneously, just as the movement in France is developing against Macron, and movements in other countries in Europe are demanding improvements in the conditions of the masses, my position is always and everywhere the defence and advance of the rights of working people across our country, across Europe and across the world. And I do not believe that there is any government in Europe or in Britain or in the United States that is standing up for the rights of the majority of the people. And that fundamentally comes down to an analysis of the class, the social structure of society. That is the question that we really need to address, that is fundamentally not being addressed in the discussion about Brexit as it is at the moment. But I do believe, and that's why I also support the idea that if it comes to it, on the 11th of December, or whatever date it is, that they want to pass this agreement on Brexit through Parliament, I believe we should oppose it. The Labour Party should oppose it and should demand a general election to transform the government of Britain, and not for the sake of Brexit, but for the sake of the people of Britain, to improve the living standards, conditions, welfare and social rights of the people, and to challenge the wealth and power of the tiny group of people, a tiny group of people who own and control the wealth of this country, and of many other. By the way, Britain is probably the biggest single, in terms of its overseas protectorates, where they act as financial scamming conduits. Britain is the strongest in the world. It has vast amounts of resources in the Cayman Islands. The Panama Papers showed the same thing, where billionaires and multimillionaires and large companies filter away the resources that they plunder from all around the world in order to maintain their position, their wealth on a global scale. And there is nothing within the British establishment that makes it better than the German establishment, or within the German establishment that makes it better than the British establishment. And therefore the central question remains, how do we unify the interests of the majority of the people of Britain, France, Germany, America, China, Africa, Asia, and so on? How do we unify the people? And by the people, I don't mean an amorphous group of any people. I'm not saying the interests of the wealthiest groups in society are the same as the interests of the poorest groups in society. They are not. That should be the starting point for understanding the world. The world they try and make out, you see, we've spent 2 years in which most of the politicians discussing on television or in Parliament, they constantly bleat to you the most important decision you've made in your life, the most important decision you'll make in your life is whether you're a member or not a member of the European Union. No, that is not the most important decision. The most important thing that affects you is how we live in our country. And how we live in our country is not decided by the members of Parliament in Britain or the members of Parliament in Germany. It's decided by the relationship between those above you and those below you. It's a relationship between landlord and tenant. The relationship between employer and employee. The relationship between the poor and the wealthy. The relationship between those who are in debt and those who have the enormous resources. Many of them, by the way, many of the wealthiest people, so they're called, are also in debt. But their debts are not like your debts, if you're poor that is. Their debts are not like the majority of the population. Their debts are excused. Their debts are covered. And when they bring the world, and that's the reason why we're in the crisis we're in, the reason why the European Union is in crisis, the reason why Brexit happened, the reason why Donald Trump was elected, the reason for the crisis in Greece, the crisis in Spain, the crisis in Portugal, in Ireland, in Iceland. What is the reason for it? It is because the bankers who organise the global financial system, controlling the economic geography and landscape of the planet, they managed to blow resources from the future on derivatives, on what they call, what was it called? I can't remember the bloody name for them. Sorry, some type of speculative a product on the global markets. I think what it's called. I can't. It'll come back to me. that they were organising the world economy for the interest of the billionaires and millionaires to plunder the wealth of the world. And when this gigantic bubble that they created, on which this gang were having a mass orgy from these resources, when that collapsed, the rest of the world was dragged down, and we were told we have to pay for generations in order to resolve the financial crisis. And at that time, they said, Gordon Brown charged around the world on behalf of British capitalism in order to save the banks. I ask you this, why did we need to save the banks? Save the banks. What is saving the banks? What does it mean? Their buildings? What does it mean? Our money? It's saving them, so the bankers themselves, so they can continue to plunder and rob the world in the name of the free market. And that, by the way, is why Spain collapsed. That, by the way, is why Greece collapsed. That is why Portugal collapsed. And the people live. These are advanced countries, don't forget. Wealthy, industrialized countries. And yet, the people, they were pensioners going onto the square. Out of hunger, they went onto the street. One of them took a shotgun to his head, blew his head off. In the middle of the government, in front of the parliament in Greece. Now, the next problem they had, justifying the demands of the far right in Britain and their acolytes inside the Conservative Party, Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage, of course, don't forget that genius, the man with a common touch they want to make out, because he has a cigarette and he drinks a glass of beer. And so because he does that, and he's white, he thinks he can start trying to promote and provoke hatred in British society. One nationality against another. The reason being, of course, that when economic crisis hits, of course, the first thing that is natural to people who do not have a world historical analysis of the system of society, the first thing they do is say, my son, when he's 18, he hasn't got anywhere to move to. And there's a Somalian moved in next door. They got a council flat. My son didn't. Well, ask yourself this. Yes, that's the appearance of what's happening. But what's the totality? Why are there not enough apartments for the people? Because if you look around you, this is Mayfair, Park Lane, number 2 on the Monopoly board. We remember all of that from our childhood. And yet in Park Lane, half the buildings are empty. Mayfair has the highest proportion of empty buildings in the whole of the country. Mayfair. So obviously, there is a problem of homelessness, but the problem of homelessness can be resolved almost immediately. How can it be resolved? You take a simple drill. You drill a hole through the lock. You open the door and you put a new lock on. And in that way, you open up the empty buildings and make them available for the people. There are, in just one sec, I'll take you one sec. In London alone, there are 700 football pitches of empty property, commercial property, in London alone, enough to house, to provide homes for up to 1 million people in London as it is now. And yet, private property is sacrosanct. All bow down and pray to that. That's the reality of the world we live in. It's not about Brexit or the European Union. It's about how the mass of the people improve their lives and use the enormous advances in science, technology and culture, education, knowledge, intercommunication. Use that as our tools, our weapons, accumulated over millions of years of knowledge and experience and passed from generation to generation. And yet that knowledge is not matched. If we got an accumulated knowledge in the minds of the people here, what is the accumulated property from 2 million years? Most people in Britain, 60% of the population, have less than £1,000 in savings. £1,000! They can't live for a month without that money. In London alone, 42% of the population have less than £100 in savings. They are compelled, therefore, not to be free, not to think, not to investigate, not to use their brains for the benefit of humanity and their family and themselves, but instead they are compelled to slave away doing useless jobs, serving useless purposes, for no reason at all, except to earn a couple of pounds to pay the landlord. You wanted to say?
Yeah, so your prescription for the homelessness problem, you said like just drill a hole and change the law and then homelessness is solved, right? How is that?
Well, it'd be easy if we have the key, but if we don't have the key, drill a hole.
How is that not theft? How is that not theft? If someone's acquired a house through a voluntary transaction...
You are right.
How is it not theft?
You are right. Property is considered sacrosanct. And the reason why buildings are empty by the tens of thousands in London, and yet thousands sleep on the streets, is because property is sacrosanct.
Can you elaborate?
So I am saying property is not sacrosanct. That's what I'm saying. And we must change the laws to make it not sacrosanct. And we must use the existing laws that allow local governments, national government, to seize empty buildings. And the laws exist, by the way, already. But they're not enforced. They're not enforced because local government officers are overstretched, overworked, and they are also generally aligned with the mindset of those people who say property is sacrosanct. That is why, more than a year and a half after Grenfell Tower burnt down, there are still dozens of families who have not been rehoused in the second wealthiest borough in the country. How can it be? On the day that Grenfell Tower burnt down, I identified a building that's been empty for a couple of years, just next to Kensington High Street, that could have housed 40 families. It's still empty now. Still empty now. And if you walk round Kensington and Chelsea, there's a warehouse. I used to live in the warehouse myself, what they call Property Guardian. The warehouse is twice the size of a football pitch. Kensal Road, White Knight Laundry. There's still only 5 people in the building. Size of a football, larger than a football pitch. So what are they talking about? They are treating the interests of billionaires above the interests of the people. And that is what's giving rise to the growing rebellion in the minds of the people. That yes, sometimes it takes a confusing character. How could it not? When the world appears to be so confusing. Everything, this park, you say to me, property is sacrosanct. How can it not be theft? The law in Britain defines Hyde Park as the Queen's Park, allowed to be used by the people, right? So it's the people's park if the Queen is the people's queen, which we're supposed to believe. And yet here we have, nice thing, not so bad, but nevertheless, how do you get a concession like that? How do you get it? Every year, a winter wonderland. That's not some people's project. Have you seen the prices there? Have you seen the prices? The poorer people in London can't afford to go there. It's for the middle class and upper classes who can afford to spend 20, 30, 40 pounds for half an hour on their kids. Or 100 pounds, drop it in an evening. No problem. Because private property is defended even in public property. Why are we getting the privatisation of the NHS? Not because we need to privatise the NHS. Sorry?
It's very inefficient.
My friend, the NHS may have some inefficiencies in it. True. I'm not disputing that possibility.
Right.
Or even that as a fact. I'll accept that. However, ask yourself this. Look at the railways in Britain. We privatised them. They used to say British Rail is inefficient. I tell you what, the privatised railways have been proven to be far more inefficient than the nationalised railways were. And in many countries in Europe, I was in Germany a couple of days ago. To be fair, you can still say to a general degree that the railways still function efficiently under German Bahn, Deutsche Bahn. In Italy and France, the railways are nationalised still. In Britain, you've got this creaking infrastructure. When they wanted to replace the escalators in Baker Street, it took them 10 years to replace the escalator. 10 bloody years. So they can't claim they are efficient. Capitalism, you see, has reached a point where some elements of capitalism are efficient and other elements of capitalism are totally and utterly parasitic. Landlord...
Can you elaborate on that bit?
Yes, I can elaborate.
I mentioned the bad bit.
Well, in London, for example, the way in which the property market is structured, the capitalist property market, is designed in a way that is utterly and completely inefficient from the standpoint of the people of London.
Could you elaborate?
Yes, I'll elaborate. If a worker in London works in the park here or in McDonald's down the road here, and they have no possibility on the wages they earn of renting or buying a property anywhere in Zone 1 or Zone 2, that adds 2 hours to their journey every day. That adds an inefficiency of, let's say, 4 million times 2. That's 8 million hours, lost hours per day, just because landlords and parasites want to jack up the prices to squeeze as much as they can out of the property built by Irish and Polish building workers decades ago, or even hundreds of years ago. That is utterly and completely parasitic from the standpoint of the people of Britain.
Not really.
Well, elaborate yourself then.
Well, I mean, if somebody wants to work in central London and they can't afford to live in central London, they have to commute in. I don't see how that's the fault of capitalism.
Well, I just pointed it. Let me point it. You raised the question about whether it was viable or correct to enter empty properties.
Yeah.
Firstly, there is the law and requisition which local councils have, which they can impose after 12 months, 6 months, 2 years, depends on each local council. They can requisition properties. Secondly, there are methods by which we can compel empty properties to be brought into use. Thirdly, it is legal in Britain to squat empty properties. Well, you shouldn't do according to whom?
Well, it's someone else's property, right? Let me
Sorry?
ask you a question. If I have started a business and that business only does voluntary transactions with my customers, and after a year of operating that business, I have enough money to buy a house down the street, why then is it okay for you to come in and change the locks on that door? If I've started a business which has made money purely through voluntary transactions with my customers, why then do you have the right to take my house which I've earned? Why is that's what
I said if the property is not being used, we should take over the empty properties. Second thing is this. Many things are legislated in this country. For example, you said, in your theory, that you are setting up a business, engaging in voluntary transactions with people. Fine. But those voluntary transactions and businesses are subject to laws and regulations, are they not?
They are indeed.
Right? Setting up a business is a legal entity. A legal entity must pay taxes.
Absolutely.
Once it reaches a certain level of income. It must make declarations, right? So these are statutory forms that govern the regulation of corporate operations. So if we have regulations that structure and regulate the ownership and use of housing, that structure and regulate rental costs, then we can impose them just the same as you can do in corporate legislation.
I'm not interested about necessarily the law, I'm what the philosophical justification. I don't understand why if I've earned the money to buy a house and I choose not to use it for whatever reason, maybe I just want to buy another house and live in a separate house. If I have a house that I've purchased legally and I choose not to use it for whatever reason that may be, why is it, or what's the philosophical justification for you to be able to say, that's my house because there's homeless people, therefore he needs a house?
The philosophical justification is twofold. One is because you are stating, and that's why I said what I said just now, you are stating that you accept there are legal parameters for the operation of a corporate structure.
100% I do agree.
So in other words, the enrichment of the person to be able to reach the point where he can buy the house is dependent upon a certain legislative structure.
Yeah, I agree with that.
His ownership rights over the house are also governed by a certain legislative structure.
Again, up to this point, I completely agree.
So, why should not the rental of the house be governed by a legislative structure? And why should not the use of the house be governed by a legislative structure?
The use.
Because
if I own the house, if I don't want to use that house, it's my prerogative not to use that house. If I own that, the property, why is it that I must have to use that property? Why must I occupy that property? Why must if I don't?
The second level, which you asked about.
I don't want to do it at my house. I don't want to use. Okay, so you don't work on that's what he's saying. You're going to go to Jamaica. You're going to go to Jamaica.
Defending the abolition of private.
Bit strong, madam, bit strong.
Destroyed herself with her ignorance.
We care about the fact that people are dying on our streets.
Oh Lord, the virtue signaling is on another level.
I actually raised a grant for charity by working in old people's homes, doing cases, and giving up loads of my time.
So the lady has posed.
Sorry, just a quick question. Is it true that according to certain businesses, if their businesses are empty and like, you know, business is not opening as usual,
We talk
but
about
they
the
allow homeless people
confiscation,
to stay in their business,
the
that means they
abolition
have to pay
of
a
rights
business
of
rent.
inheritance.
Is that true?
One sec, my friend. You asked what the philosophical basis is.
Yeah.
The lady expressed it.
To help people.
Very badly.
No.
Irrational.
It is. That society is not just composed, which of course is the theoretical framework that you're starting from. Society, you believe, should and is justifiably founded upon the transactional basis you described. So in other words, society must, should and will be organised around corporate transactions governing society. Capitalism, in other words. Right? The fundamental philosophical foundation for what you're arguing is that. What the lady here has said is that even if you accept capitalism, then there is also the views of society that encroach on that framework, that impose their laws, moral and legal, on that society. And every time you investigate when a politician discusses something or argues for something, you will always find they will on the one side say, this is my foundational view, if they're honest, and then they'll say, but this can be ameliorated or adjusted according to how society feels about something. If society feels that people dying on the streets in the cold is bad, society has a right to legislate to change that. If society feels that we should have the right to vote at 16, society can legislate that. And if that means that 16 to 18-year-olds, just one second, I'll take you one sec. If that means then that 16 to 18-year-olds, for the first time, can impose their will on society, that is what happens. That's how a so-called democracy is supposed to function. So I am appealing in a platform which allows me to speak in a democracy for such a viewpoint. You're asking why? Because there is a contrast between the interests, the views, the aspirations and the ideas of the wealthiest people, the landowners, the capitalists and the workers and the tenants. There is a conflict of interest, and I side unequivocally on the side of the workers against the capital, because I'm a good person, but because I believe that is a greater justification and has more widespread support in society, a wider basis to gather support in society, I'll amend that, than does your view. However, your view dominates the world we live in. I'm not denying that.
Okay, so let me get this straight. What society thinks, what works, and what people actually choose doesn't really matter all that much. What really matters is what the society feels. That's what you're transmitting.
I'm not translating
what matters
that.
is not what
That's
works,
not what I said.
but what feels nice.
That's not what I said. What I said, no, he asked me.
Well, you were talking
He
about
asked
what the
me.
society feels.
Well, he asked me for a philosophical argument as to that. And of course, everything in the world is governed to some degree by how we feel about something. If in your transactional relationships you decide to go and buy a bottle of water from a shop, it's because you feel, for some reason, that that bottle of water is the one you want, and that other one is the one you don't want. Everything, to some degree, is governed by your personal, intuitive and psychological state. In other words, by your feelings. When Aristotle and Plato talked about the good, they're talking about what a person feels is good. And in fact, there is something anchored in the human brain that relates to that. There's something, for example, like it or not, whether you like my arguments or not, there is something that draws you to my meetings every week, even though you don't agree with me, right? I don't mind. It's good, right? Now, just the same, underwater, there's a visceral phenomena in all vertebrae. A fish swimming in the water, they will swim in shoals, and when they have a sense, perhaps light or warmth, they will move as a group towards that. Human beings seek out, if you wander around London and you're looking around at other people, what do you think you're looking for? You're looking for some human interconnection with the other people in society. That is why the alienated state we live in the society we live in today, leads us to feel, there are many people, for example, in my own entourage of people. In the last year, I've been confronted with multiple people who are suffering from severe depression or are suicidal. This is a very recent phenomenon that I'm experiencing, that in my own entourage, large numbers of people are on the edge of either mental breakdown or suicide. Now that is because, in my opinion, it's because of a social phenomenon affecting mass psychology, affecting how people feel, right? Now, if you rent a flat across the road here and you pay £400 a week, I'll put it in monetary terms, and then you find that once you're in the flat that it's suffering from severe damp, mould, and it's got asbestos falling from the roof, you won't feel good about that, about your transaction. And so feelings are not simply abstract phenomena, they are integrated together with our transactional relationships. In fact, the transactional relationships tend to distort those feelings. And it's the nature of capitalism that transactions govern society rather than the aspirations, ideals and culture of the people.
I usually say that if you are well-spoken, even the most rotten and worst argument in the world will seem like pure virtue to everybody who's listening.
Okay.
And you are a well-spoken person. And that is exactly what draws me to talk to you every single time. Because I just
There's no
know,
financial transaction, though, is there?
No financial transaction.
Right.
Because I know that people will believe you. Because you know how to appeal
you're here
to
to
their
counter me.
feelings. Sorry?
If you look on the YouTube discussions, people are watching you, they say they agree or they disagree, he's right, he's wrong, no problem. You have access to discuss in this meeting. I'm not
Yes,
stopping
that's
you.
not what I'm talking about.
And you can stand up and speak as well.
That's not what I'm
right,
talking
so
about.
you are drawn towards a certain type of human communication,
No, I'm drawn
non-transactional.
to a certain type
And after
of
all-
ideology. A certain type of ideology that is spread by you, who are a well-spoken person and who shows this on the basis of feelings. Now, let me give you the difference between feelings and facts. There are no absolute facts, nothing that is the absolute irrefutable truth in the world. But there are things that are more probable to work. For example, if you feel bad for the homeless people and you act on pure feelings and you allow as many as possible into your house, that's not reasonable at all. Because you're just
said it
letting
was?
it's
Who said it
because
was?
you're acting on sheer feelings. You're not planning
But
things.
who is
you're
saying
not being
that?
reasonable.
I'm not understanding.
Because you appeal to the
My
feelings
friend,
of the people
I didn't
always,
do that.
all
That's
the
not
time.
correct. That's not-
That is
Look,
very
a
correct.
child-
You keep appealing, keep saying
If
there's
you look-
homeless
if you
people
look-
and there are
if you look
houses
at modern-
that are not being used. That's
If you
your
look
appeal.
at modern psychology, the attempts to form a science of psychology, attempts, right? If you look at those attempts, they start from a child. If you look at a baby, you see the baby is a visceral feeling entity. It doesn't have logic. It doesn't have transactional relationship. When it doesn't have milk, it screams, right? When it feels uncomfortable, it screams. That's the foundation for you as a human being, right? The child isn't there. They're not looked after by the mother because the mother is paid to look after them. Human beings have looked after children long before money existed. And so there are roots, anchors, foundations upon which things are built. Whereas what your arguments tend to point towards, not just today, but throughout the arguments you've made in my meetings at Speaker's Corner, your arguments are founded on the idea that everything is a transactional relationship and that the feeling elements, the elements of human psychology, the elements of ideology, they are simply, I don't know, icings on the cake built around a transactional relationship. However, I disagree. I do agree, however, that transactional relationships, economics of exchange, is the foundation of modern society. And it distorts, amends and adjusts the character of human beings. And I believe it dehumanizes people. And it dehumanizes not only the person who says, I'm not giving that to the homeless person, it also dehumanizes the homeless person themselves. And it dehumanizes all of society. Because we walk around the streets and we see people on the streets who are homeless. We assume, often correctly, that they are drug addicts or that they are drink alcoholics. And then we assume that because of that, somehow they are undeserving.
So true.
Right? They are undeserving because they're drunks. But of course, if you're a judge, you know the phrase in English, used to be a phrase everyone would say, drunk as a judge or drunk as a lord. Right? Because the House of Lords is full of drunks. Winston Churchill, one of his most famous retorts, when a woman turned round to him in the House of Parliament and said, Winston Churchill, you're drunk. And he said, yes, madam, I may be drunk. But tomorrow you'll still be ugly, whereas I'll be sober. That's what he said. That's what he said.
That's a nice burn.
The point being that drunkenness is only abhorrent when it's somebody who's homeless. If someone's wealthy and they're drunk every day, it doesn't matter. If someone's a heroin addict and they're a multi-millionaire, no one cares. Do you think
He
people
was
care
functional.
that Russell Brand
It's because
was
of
a heroin
Churchill
addict?
that England
You think
didn't
people
lose the
care?
war.
You think
Churchill
people-
made the right decisions. It's because he's functional that people don't
Of
care if he
course,
was a drunk
of
or not.
course.
If you start drinking and you completely lose yourself in the drink, that's not good. If you start drinking
but if
and you
you're a-
still function well
you're a
in society, then it shouldn't be looked
My
in
friend,
the same
my
eyes.
friend.
No, the difference is that's
you
the
function
thing.
well in society.
That's the thing, man.
If you're a millionaire.
That's the thing. You
It's
are
not
a
hard,
very
is it?
dangerous person. You are a dangerous person because you know how to show these feelings as truths to people, even though they are only perceptions.
My friend,
Your
my
perceptions.
friend, what can I transmit?
There is a
Let's
difference.
just take that apart. What am I transmitting?
There is a difference.
What am I
There is
transmitting
a-
here?
You're transmitting
I'm
what
speaking.
you're transmitting.
I'm speaking. One, my
You're
body,
trying to make
my
people
mind.
feel things, and you're trying to make them act completely
I
out
supposed
of
to do?
sheer feeling.
Get a PowerPoint presentation?
No, you're
and a
supposed to
mask?
explain them what will
That's
work.
what Speaker's Corner is. What is
You're
speaking?
supposed to show them
What
ideals
is-
that will work, that will actually
According to
work,
who?
that will produce results.
What do you mean,
According
can
to
produce results?
history.
How do you
history
make things
proves
happen?
that your ideology has never worked.
How does it prove it?
How does history prove that
How does
Marxism
history
has
prove?
never worked?
How does history
You want me
prove
to
it?
give the same example?
No, I don't want you to give
Sir,
that.
simple question. So if Marxism made 4 claims, which he did, and it did, 2 economic,
Made more than 4, but
2
anyway,
economic
carry on.
and 2 moral, and up until 1956, the economic ones, in terms of the size and shape of the middle class, upper class, and the economic participation, and the moral claims that a socialist system would be a humane media of organisation, and we would share well, have been disproven empirically. In 1848, Marx wrote that I would be judged after he misread Hegel's dialectic.
what?
Marx himself wrote after misjudging Hegel that he will be judged by scientific materialism. So we hold Marx to those 4 claims, and all focused on what's the epistemological
Okay.
basis for modern
I've
Marxism.
just been writing an article for the School of
question.
Slavonic and East European Studies on socialism and capitalism in China. Now I ask you this. Who thinks China is capitalist?
I did.
It's not completely capitalist.
But it's a state form.
Is it dominated by capitalism?
It
or
has
not?
an economical capitalist system, but if you mean the media and the indoctrination, it's a very totalitarian socialist state.
What's the official ideology?
It's a mix. It's not a
What's
pure.
the official
it's not-
ideology?
Communist Party.
Communism.
Okay, the
Is
official
the
one is
official
communism,
ideology.
let's say.
Now,
Socialism, not
now
communism.
everybody knows there is a significant layer of capitalism in China. Everybody knows that.
Yes.
So the question is, if you think, as many people do, that China's about to become, or near to becoming, the #1 power in the world, possibly. I'm not saying you have to agree, but it's possible. Right?
Highly likely.
And it's capitalist, and it's got a Marxist ideology. What does it mean?
But it's not a refutation of my question of the 4 claims.
Well, it would be in this respect, I'll come back to them, but it would be in this respect that if you're saying Marxism is refuted, and then the government of what could be the most powerful economy in the history of the world claims it's Marxist, clearly you've got a problem on your hands.
No, because I think you're pure.
Because then, either capitalism has its highest form in Marxism, or Marxism is a false ideology, right? An invented ideology, a trick. But if the people are being tricked by this, is it just because they're in guns head at their heads?
It's a very. It's,
Every study shows in China, human happiness and contentment with the social system is higher than almost any country in the world. Coming to your question, that's not because I believe China is Marxist, but it's because there is a dilemma for the opposite standpoint. Now, coming back to your original question, the first part,
2 economic, 2 moral claims.
the first economic claim. Sorry, just repeat.
2 economic claims. The class.
Right, okay, just that one. First, the decline of the middle class. Marx was discussing in the 1840s until he died in 1883 the dynamics of a world system, not a national system, a world system. Now that world system, did it really create a larger proportionate middle class? Has it? Compared to the world in 1848. Sorry?
Compared to Marxism. So I want to put Marx accountable by scientific criticism.
Right, so that's what I'm saying.
So the middle class says,
But isn't the phenomena of Donald Trump's election and of Bernie Sanders' strength in the election as well, wasn't that a reflection of the fact that both of them stated openly and clearly the middle class is being decimated?
Yeah, that's financially.
What is the middle class if it isn't financially middle class? Do you mean how they feel or how they are?
no, the number of.
Well, that's the question.
No, but the number of them has not fallen.
How do you define them? Do you define them financially, or do you define them by their psychology?
Well, there's two of them. I define them financially first in terms of holding Marxist claim. Interestingly, you say psychology because Marx's symmetrical claims were moral claims.
Well, Marx made two claims about the condition of classes. One is their actual condition. So in other words, we could extrapolate from the point of view of this argument, the idea of the financial position. So the declining position of the middle class in America is an indication, that's the richest country in the world, is an indication of a verification of Marx's argument. On the other side, you could argue that the psychology is a different one. And the psychological attitude of the middle class is to hold on to their position, to try to maintain their position vis-à-vis the person below them. Now that's perfectly true. That's what, after all, gave rise to Adolf Hitler. Because the middle classes, those who had been elevated in the period after the First World War, those people lost their savings and their earnings. And therefore they felt someone else was to blame for that loss and turned on the communists, the socialists and the Jews. Right? Now we have the same phenomena. People like Tommy Robinson, small businessman, doing reasonably well in his plumbing business, £400,000 a year income. Suddenly, when he stands up for what he believes in other words, all Muslims are potential jihadists, and he must fight the Islamic ideology because somehow it's praying to a fairy in the sky, unlike the Christian God, which somehow is a fairy on earth or something like that. But he says Muslims are basically sucked into this mad ideology. Whereas him, as a middle-class Englishman, well-to-do, hard-working English lad, just like Nigel Farage, he and his mates have lost their position because all these bloody Muslims are coming into our country, stealing our jobs and groom-ganging our children, right? So that's where that ideology of the lost middle class is going. That's why we have the phenomena we have in Germany, in France, in Britain and America. The psychology, in other words, the class consciousness of the middle class is such that because they are not the fundamental producers of wealth, they are neither the big capitalists nor are they the workers. Therefore, because they live an intermediate form of parasitism, they are unable to anchor themselves in the material structure of society. Their psychology is lost. They vacillate between the upper stratum and the lower.
So the single line,
sometimes
you're a pure Marxist.
Sorry?
You're the single line, you're pure Marxist because you're holding on to the initial Marxist claim is that the people will revolt against capitalism.
I have no doubt about that.
Okay, so that's because that is currently contra-narrative to the data. There's no data
It's
saying
not
that
that
this
it's
is occurring.
contra-narrative to the data.
It is because they haven't.
Well, what is the data?
The data
is the evidence of the political processes happening in the world today.
The data saying
In
the
Germany,
class.
the rise of the AfD. What's that about? From suddenly in a country where they've spent since 1945 until 2018, they've spent billions and billions of dollars, marks or euros, on fighting the idea of fascism, of Nazism, of racial intolerance, and yet here we have a country where such views are becoming widespread. Now in Britain and Europe, we had the European Union coming together, everyone joining together in a united front for a new world where the countries, that was the idea, where the countries would gradually be closer and closer together.
So I have to
the
agree.
borders between the countries would disappear. The money would be unified. Capitalism would create a utopian, pan-European and potentially global system of economy, politics and culture. Instead of this, it reached a certain point, and after the economic crisis of 2008, the whole thing has been turned into its reverse.
So can I just say
That
this,
is
sir?
the fundamental
So can I
process.
just say-
Reflected in Brexit, the whole conversation in Britain is Brexit. Brexit, 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 right?
But you're right.
What is it about?
No, but you're right that something is lost. And what's lost is a sense of the individual as a citizen as opposed to a consumer. What's lost is the idea that value and meaning is more than just an economic transaction. But how dare the Marxists or communists or the capitalists make claim that they have the solution to that reaching of it?
My friend,
why would the Marxists
everybody
any
who claims
ground
to be political and to have a political standpoint is stating that they believe their view is correct. What else does it mean? I mean, you don't expect someone to come on telly, you know, Theresa May or Jeremy Corbyn or God knows who, and then they're going to ask the question, yeah, but do you believe what you say? And they go, no, I don't believe a word of it. It's just stupid.
But Marx has no track record of delivering its propositional
What do you mean no track record of Britain?
How many communist and socialist
My
countries
friend,
have
if someone
how many
in this
communist
audience has a heart attack now,
Yep.
an ambulance will come out, paramedics will come out, they'll take him to hospital and they'll try to cure that person of his illness.
Pretty sharp.
For free.
Yeah.
That's Marxist, my friend.
For free.
That's as close as you... Marx's slogan at the end of the Communist Manifesto was, society will inscribe on its banner, from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. That is the National Health Service.
And you know what Aristotle said? Tolerance is the last virtue of a dying civilization.
Exactly.
Well,
Tolerance, as the idea
Well-
of your moral framework that you will cure the world by tolerance, is insufficient.
okay, there is a small problem. I will quote you another quote. It's not quote wars,
I was about to say.
but
Sounds like
I
it,
will
sounds
quote
like
you. I will quote Aristotle
like
back at
He
you.
has lots of quotes.
I will quote Aristotle back at you to contextualize the condition and the circumstances in which he lived. And the reasons why he said what he said. Greek society, the foundation of democracy, which means rule by the people, at the time when that was the case, Aristotle said, slaves are speaking tools. Speaking tools. So no wonder he wasn't going to listen to a slave. Tolerance of the words of a slave was tolerance of a tool, telling you what to do. Whereas human beings are supposed to be in command of tools, right? So, the context in which something is said is important to understand its meaning, right? So if you talk about intolerance, well, of course, the Roman rulers, how else did Jesus Christ end up on a tree? Or as some people say, on a cross?
It was
Because he was considered to be a threat to the rule of the Romans, right? So the idea, and of the Jews, so the idea that these things can be taken out of their historical context and then bleated about like some Christian lunatic at Speaker's Corner,
God bless.
Many of
I
those.
think it's false.
Too many of
You have
those.
to understand context. Context is everything, not content. Context.
Content is-
Although content is also good. So, understanding the context is important. You said to me, Marxism has no relevance. Well, I tell you this. When the Labour Party was founded in 1900,
It's a good party there.
you say it was a good party then. The party has today the most left-wing leader since the foundation of the Labour Party.
Party of its times, yeah.
The most left. Now, why do you think that is? You think it's because Jeremy Corbyn somehow spirited the people who voted in the Labour Party and in the Labour Party leadership election? He beguiled them with some strange psychological hocus pocus. He hypnotised them with some stories
to do things
so
that feel
beyond
good.
what?
You know, I like the example in
Jeremy
Hitler.
Corbyn.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
it's hardly spirited.
Yes, I like
So-
the example that you gave in
So the
Hitler
question
because it
is-
proves more than anything I could say that you shouldn't follow a person that appeals to emotion all the time. And that's what Jeremy Corbyn is
Jeremy
doing.
Corbyn
That's
is
what
appealing to
Bernie
emotion.
Sanders was doing. That's what you are doing. Because that's what socialists always do. They can't appeal to reason because there is no
My friend,
reason
what
in their
is-
ideology.
What is the
Gentleman is not a
difference?
socialist.
What
is
is
the
the difference
distinction?
between
What is the
feelings
distinction between
and senses?
reason
There is a
and
big
sense?
difference between the two.
What is the difference?
The difference is that sense follows. You mean sense, common sense?
No.
Is
I
that
tell
the
you
sense
this,
you mean?
your argument.
Or senses?
Why are
It's
we
the
arguing
senses
here
that we
today?
have.
Why are we arguing?
We are arguing because both you and I agree that we need to get to the same place, but we as a
I don't know if we agree on that.
No, we do. But we, as a neo-reactionary, I disagree that you have anything in the answer that we're getting.
It's something a bit more deep than that I want.
Okay.
Why are we arguing here if reason is the only foundation for an argument?
But reason is disputed by Kant. It's
If
not.
reason, well, I won't go on to Kant because I've never read him.
Okay.
We can
If
discuss reason. We can't
if
discuss
reason
feelings.
is the only
because
argument
feelings
you
are
can
the most
argue
objective
about,
thing ever.
why do you need to discuss in Hyde Park? Why do you need to open your mouth? There's been books written already. All you have to do is compare the books and prove which is right. And that must be the truth, because that's reason.
Because nobody's following the books. Nobody actually wants
Why
to
is
know
that?
things.
If
because
reason's
people
the only
want to
basis for
follow their
argument.
feelings. Because
You just told
following
me
their
reason
feelings
is the basis
feels
for all
good.
arguments that should be had.
It should be, but
Why?
it is
How
not.
can it be?
Because it's easier
How
to
should it
exploit
be?
feelings than to explain people what
So
works.
how would
You know,
one argue?
This is the
How
discussion.
would one argue?
This is the discussion between a dentist and a candy shop seller. The candy shop seller will
lost me there, bro.
will tell everybody, you know, my sweets will taste good, and this guy, he wants you to hurt. He wants to hurt you people. He wants to make you feel
Dentist.
pain. The dentist. But what will the dentist say? You know, he makes people feel pain, but he will make them feel better in the long run.
Well, but
he can't
they're
explain
not
it to the
contradictory.
people immediately.
Everybody who goes to the dentist, I'm pretty sure, has eaten sweets. So, you know, are
I want to hear what
you
you
arguing
didn't understand
that the
a little
dentist
part-
should
even a little
impose
part
on
of the
everybody,
example
because
I gave you.
dentistry is scientific, that the dentist should impose on everybody what they should eat?
The example I'm giving to you is to prove that if you exploit feelings and tell people things
But
that
everyone exploits feelings, my friend.
not everyone, you can exploit feelings to a
doesn't?
certain extent.
Tell me one political figure in the world who
Of
doesn't
course,
exploit
they will
feelings.
eventually
When
exploit
I'm
feelings
speaking-
to some extent.
He fucks your feelings.
Donald Trump
still exploits
exploits feelings. He does. He
Still
does
exploits
exploit
feelings.
But
My
my
friend,
point
how,
is,
show me 5 sentences, or 1 or 2 sentences, where you have no feeling whatsoever.
politicians need to
That's
exploit
feeling. You're
feelings.
feeling there.
Sorry,
You're saying that with feeling.
I can
You're
prove
saying
it.
politicians.
I can prove it by
now,
examples.
There's another side.
That's the difference. You can't prove feelings.
Now-
you can't prove that your feelings are
quote
better
you
than mine.
or
I can
para-quote
prove that
you
my
one other
arguments are
person.
better. My arguments are
Antonio
better than
Gramsci.
yours.
Not the long
Antonio
march.
Gramsci
He should be
said.
hung here. in
He's
this spot.
Antonio Gramsci. He's an Italian Marxist, very influential Italian Marxist. And what he said was this. He said, everybody, or most people, have what he calls common sense views. Common sense views tend to be aligned with interests, economic, social interests. Now, those interests cannot be justified by rational structural arguments by the majority of the people, because they haven't read enough to know
Yes,
this.
that's true.
I can't back up an
defend their own
argument
reason.
about Kant because I've never read him.
But you don't have to.
I could wing it and pretend. I could lie to you.
Yeah, but
I could look up Wikipedia for 5 minutes and try and outquote you and con you, but I'm not going to do that.
No.
However, when I talk about Marx, I can't claim to be the incarnation of every argument that Marx has ever said.
You're very good at
I
that.
can't claim to be the correct interpreter of everything that's been said by him or by his followers. All I can do is express in a common sense way the view that I have as it's associated and anchored in my personal background and psychology, and express it to others and see how it connects to their mind. But I will do so when I speak, as opposed to when I write, in an emotional state.
Very well.
As anyone will when they speak and discuss.
Nothing wrong with
and
that.
nobody can tolerate listening to anybody in Hyde Park for more than 5 minutes if they don't express something in an emotional sense.
I'm not
That is
arguing
the
with
nature
that.
of oratory.
Now the thing
Oratory
is
an art.
all
It's not
you're
a
dealing
science.
with
But I
is
love what you're
feelings.
saying, and I have a question
It's fine. It's fine. Look, it's fine to feel what you're talking about. It's fine for you to express feelings. It's fine for you to appeal to feelings. But you need something to back it up. You need some kind of history, of historical knowledge. You need some kind. Listen, you're not backing up your feelings by
I was reading a book
anything.
this week by a man by the name of E.H. Carr. And he wrote a book called What is History? I recommend you read it. Defensive history as well. No, it's What is History, the book I read. And in this book he makes the point, because I was talking about this a couple of weeks ago. For 2 million years, people have made things. They've had stone tools. And from the stone tool and the hand axe, we've reached the mobile phone and nanotechnology, right? Now, however, the majority of the world, that's what I focus on when I talk about Speaker's Corner, have almost no possessions. Nothing to speak of from these 2 million years of transmitting property from generation to generation. 2 million years of ancestors. We've got nothing. And yet we do have, through the internet, through our libraries, through television archives, we have records of human knowledge throughout 2 million years of accumulated. Our brains have become assimilated and elastic enough to acquire that knowledge from 2 million years of experience and have transmitted information. And therefore, I believe it is perfectly rational, it's perfectly rational to approach history both ideologically and intellectually and culturally from the assimilated knowledge of the past, and to apply that same approach to property itself. The accumulation of property over 2 million years should also be looked at as a process, and that process needs to be understood in a way, in my opinion, such that it rationally is reorganized to serve the development of the future of the next 2 million years of human existence, rather than as it is now, where 8 people own more wealth than half of the world. After 2 million years of human production, those 2.5 billion people who earn less than $2 a day, they have as much right, rationally and emotionally, to have the life of the wealthy people in the world. But that's not even the case that's most important. Because even in the wealthiest countries in the world, the people do not have property and wealth. They live in penury. They live in wage slavery, 8 hours, 10 hours a day, working for the man, for sod all, just to pay their rent, pay their bills, and return to work the next week.
What do you propose to solve this?
Exactly.
I propose a reduction of the working week.
Okay.
The working week should be reduced immediately to 30 hours.
And an increase in taxes.
And within a few years, it should be reduced to 24 hours. A 6-hour working day, 4-day working week. How does that add to wealth? It adds to wealth because it frees up the human being. Just like Aristotle was free from working because he had slaves. So at the instruments of production, the tools, the robots, the machines, the computers, they should be our slaves. Not instruments to enslave us with.
Right, but should not. It's all idealistic. How do we apply this?
It's not idealistic.
Yes.
How do we apply it?
It's a
My
utopia,
friend,
man.
my friend, years ago,
I want to
when I was
fix the world
speaking
like
at
you, but
Speaker's
Never
Corner,
worked in the past. Never. What
friend.
you're proposing never worked, and it never will.
Working week in the first place.
Have you never heard the phrase, try, and try again?
Here we go again.
Have you never heard that?
Can I bust
You
your bubble
don't
with
try
one more
something just
claim?
because.
Can I burst
You
your
try
You try
something
and argue with me
because
every week.
Huh?
He does.
You try and argue with me
Yes,
every week.
because I have
Why?
arguments. A new argument.
Why
or
do
the
you do
same
it?
argument.
No, I didn't say what you say. I say you try and argue with me every week.
Yes.
You know I'm a lost cause. Why do you do it?
I don't do it for you, man. As you said, you're a lost cause.
You do that a laugh, my friend.
Likes to make himself a fool in the camera.
Yeah, sure. I do it for the people who are standing here because no, seriously. I don't do it. I'm not that benevolent. I don't do it. I'm not gonna try to make myself look like the White Knight here. I don't do it so the people know. I do it because if people like you, have enough popularity,
another week we can have people like you
then
arguing.
okay, sure.
So what has
Then
changed
we'll have
after
things like
1956 and the 1960s and the
Oh, you seem to be
collapse of
learning too from him.
old-school
He's your
communism
sensei, it seems.
has now
You also
shown up in the
run after
birth
him like
of
his
the
doggy.
new
Like his pet
hyper-material
doggy.
scientific
You
future
should
we talk
first.
about.
Okay.
In this hyper-scientific future, for the last 10 to 15 years in one of my career strands is I worked for the banks and helped repair their credit in 2008 as a scientist and a person of numbers. And we now know from our
Person of
similar...
numbers.
Yeah,
Nice one.
that's good. Hey.
Man of
So-
lessons, man of numbers.
Yeah, man of 2 days. But, and we know now with the most complicated piece of information we deliver in the Western capitalist system is the morning regulatory risk report. Every night, for the entire world...
Doesn't keep me
hear
awake.
out. No, it won't keep you awake. It keeps everything else running, thank God.
Well, there you go.
But, you know, so in that report, what it tells us is we only can predict of our loss. This is an attack on capitalism, so I think you like it. Even our capitalist models and any social distribution models must materialize in a set of projections which say everything we thought is a risk of the past is looked at a risk in the future,
I think you're making
and we
a speech.
calculate those numbers.
I think you're making a speech.
No, I'm not trying to make a speech. So my
Yes,
question
because
is-
it's
so
reason
my
and
question
not
is,
feelings.
No communist
That's
or
why it's
capitalist,
boring
simple English,
for you
no
guys.
communist or capitalist can give me a systemic way to manage and control a complex money.
I'm just.
the
I'm putting
capitalists
it
are
very,
lying.
I
the
tend
communists are
to
lying.
put the question very simply.
Find out for yourself.
I tend to answer the question very simply.
all live on farms.
There's loads of authors.
You can't answer complicated questions
Try and
with
answer.
simple
Try and
answers.
answer.
Emma
I
Goldman.
want to appeal Marxist.
I will try to answer you at the moment very simply. Another week,
ahead.
that's a whole discussion. I don't deny that.
But you're
But
good
at the
for
moment,
Marxists.
I will try and answer you very simply.
Yeah.
I believe that the increasing participation of the mass of people around the world in political life, including gaining the right to vote, gaining the right to strike, exercising their right to speak, that has spread like wildfire in the last 50 years, right? 50 years ago, we didn't live in a world dominated by democracy,
You could have this conversation.
even parliamentary democracy.
This would not be happening.
So that is one process that has been happening. On the other side, there is enormous advance in technology. So if you match those two, if you say there's a trajectory behind those two things, then you can predict the potentiality for a combination of the two things. That's how we'll answer you. But I will elaborate in more detail next week. Kai would like to say a few words. Thanks very much for participating.
Heiko. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hi everybody, thank you very much Heiko for letting me use your ladder and enlightening me about the situation with Jeremy Corbyn. Unfortunately, I'm not going to have time to build on and elaborate on what Heiko just said, which is usually what I do when he lets me use his ladder. Today, I have an urgent appeal to all of you. In about 10-15 minutes, I'm going to be walking down to the Embassy of Ecuador, where the whistleblower publisher and WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is being kept without charge, without having committed any crime, by the UK government in imprisonment. Worse than imprisonment, actually. If you're a prisoner in the United Kingdom, you usually have a right to see your family members, you usually have a right to walk outside in the prison yard. Julian Assange has been kept in 2 rooms in the Embassy of Ecuador for 6 years. 6 years he's been in the same 2 rooms. Now, whatever you think of the man and his relationship with the British state, with the US state, I think I'll build on what Heiko said about free speech. There has been these movements have been spreading like wildfire since the Arab Spring, partially thanks to WikiLeaks revelations. Now, if you value freedom of speech, if you value freedom of the press, then I hope you'll join me. I'm going to wait under that lamppost behind us right now. I'm going to wait for 5 minutes, and if anyone would like to join me to walk down to the embassy, it's about a 20-minute walk away from here. We can have a 6-minute vigil representing the 6 years that Julian Assange has been kept by the UK government under lock and key in that embassy. I understand if your politics are not the same as mine. I'm not trying to convince you to join me, or I'm not trying to tell you what to do. I'll let you find out the facts for yourself if you have the time and the inclination. But I will be there and I will leave in 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Heiko, for letting me speak.
Thank you.
That's all I wanted to say. I hope you have a very nice evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Finally, some kind of
Content over everything. From your government.
Man, say it straight. Man, don't listen to BBC. Man, don't listen to ITV.
He did hang in there. He did hang in there.
Because again, like we were saying, when was America great? And again, I said, when you go to the white man, regardless of whatever, the only time you're accepted by the white man is when they want you to turn against us.
Yes.
When they want you to play the middleman, they've always done that through history. But with black people, we've always accepted you. Regardless, you will never ever be accepted. Not even from your whole family, you will be accepted. Even if they let one.
Only people who call me white.